Thank you very much, Jan. Welcome everyone again at Brainwash Digital. As said, my name is Eveline Groot and I will be interviewing the world-famous philosopher Michael Sandel for the next 50 minutes or so. We will be talking about Sandel's new book, The Tyranny of Merit, What's to Become of the Common Good. Here it is. And this book can be understood as Sandel's response to the election of Donald Trump and Brexit. In our Western world, we are dealing with more and more crises. And then I'm not solely talking about the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic that we are obviously all dealing with, but also we are also dealing with growing inequality, systemic discrimination, and democratic norms and civic virtues that are under pressure. So in this situation, the question seems to be how we can find our way to a new politics of the common good. And this is exactly the question that Sandel raises in his new book, The Tyranny of Merit. So we will be discussing Sandel's analysis for about 45 minutes. And as Jan has already told you, then there will be time for 2 questions of you, of the audience. Before we start, let me properly introduce Michael Sandel, who is joining us today all the way from Boston, USA. Michael Sandel teaches political philosophy at Harvard University. His online lectures on justice have been watched for more than 1 million times only on YouTube. His books, What Money Can Buy, The Moral Limits of Markets, and Justice, What is the Right Thing to Do, have been translated in 27 languages. Sandel's BBC series, The Global Philosophers, as well as his VPRO series, What is the Right Thing to Do and Change Your Mind, they explore philosophical ideas behind the news headlines with participants from all over the world. So he is truly a not only a political philosopher, but also a public philosopher, you could say. Well, as mentioned, today he is joining us to talk about his new book, The Tyranny of Merit, and I'm very excited to be interviewing him. Welcome, Professor. It's great to have you here, at least virtually.
Thank you, Evelina. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so it's great to have you here. And how are you? Are you well?
Yes, thanks. We're here in Boston. I'm at home where I've been with my family really since the pandemic began. And so, but we feel fortunate to be able to communicate remotely as we're doing here, while at the same time realizing that a great many people in our society do not have the same luxury of being able to work from home.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's the tragic part, right? Like some people are very fortunate, have a very positive, good situation now, and others are really, really suffering immensely. I think we will be talking about that divide, right, between people who are doing actually quite well at the moment and people who are not. I want to start with your analysis of the current situation, what is going on. And you kind of frame this analysis by you referring to the Rhetoric of Rising. And the Rhetoric of Rising is a broad idea, but one of the aspects is also the use of a certain rhetoric in politics. And in your book, you refer, for example, to Obama, who likes to use the epithet smart or intelligent for certain policies or solutions. And to bring this example home to the Netherlands, here in the Netherlands, we've had, now we are having our second lockdown, but we had our first lockdown. And the Prime Minister actually came up with the term intelligent lockdown. Let's call our Dutch lockdown an intelligent lockdown, which is a smart way of phrasing. It has a political idea behind it. And in your book, you are referring to this idea as sort of problematic and not neutral at all. Can you maybe explain why this political rhetoric is problematic?
Yes. Well, thank you for that question. And it's fascinating, the Dutch example that you just mentioned. The language of intelligent lockdown or smart policy. Indeed, the language of merit, on the face of it, is appealing. We want policies that are intelligent and that are smart. Who could be against smart or intelligent policies? And for that matter, who could be against merit as a way of deciding who gets ahead, who receives social roles that are important, who gets to govern. And yet, merit and the rhetoric of rising, the rhetoric of smart, the rhetoric of being intelligent, this rhetoric has a dark side. That's the main argument of the book. It's appealing, it's attractive. We've heard it more and more in the last few decades than in the past. But it tells us something important about the shape of our politics and the shape of our civic life. And I'm sure we'll get into what it reveals, but in brief, what it tells us, first, it's worth noticing that this language, the rhetoric of rising, you can make it if you try. Mm-hmm. What you earn depends on what you learn. Everyone should be able to rise as far as his or her talents will take them. This rhetoric, which is inspiring in one way, is invidious, insulting in another way, because it puts great emphasis on being smart, which in our society means being credentialed. It means getting a university degree with the expectation that that university degree will be the basis for rising, for landing on top, for achieving success, and for deserving success. For deserving success. This is where the idea of merit connects with the idea of being smart, of being credentialed, of being well educated. Now, I'm very much in favor of higher education. Don't get me wrong, I've spent my career in it. But the book is critical of a certain political project. The project that responds to the deepening inequality of recent decades, not by confronting that inequality directly and trying to do something about it, but instead by offering people a way out, by saying to working people, or those who may struggle in the new economy, by telling them, go to college, go to university, and if you do, then maybe you too will be able to rise. This is the rhetoric of rising. We can see how, though it seems inspiring, you can make it. You too can go to university and rise. There is implicit in that message a certain kind of insult to those who haven't been to university, who don't have prestigious credentials, who are not flourishing in the new economy. What it tells them is, your failure is your fault. This is the dark side of meritocracy. Ultimately, this message, this rhetoric of rising, is corrosive of the common good because it leaves a great many people behind. Not only that, it tells them their struggles are their fault. They have no one to blame but themselves.
Yeah, it's also interesting because you described that, talents are cherished, they are valued, they get credit, they get a certain value, but it is very specific which talents get valued and which talents don't. Can you maybe, why is there such a division between intelligence and unintelligence, between people who work with their head and with their hands? Why do we take one thing as valuable and the other not?
Well, there's one answer, the familiar conventional answer. It goes something like this. As technology advances, it puts a greater and greater emphasis on being smart, on going to university, on being well educated. And as globalization makes the economy competitive across national borders, this too puts a greater emphasis on those who are well educated. It prizes their talents, talents of being able to compete for admission to a top university and to do well. So according to the standard definition, it's just the nature of the world that's changed, that insists on, it demands greater intellectual talents, gifts, and higher education. And the economy just naturally has evolved in such a way as to heap greater and greater rewards on those who have advanced degrees. But I think this conventional answer to your question, Evelina, is misleading.
In what way?
Because I'm sorry?
In what way?
I think it's misleading. It's certainly true that the premium, the wage advantage of those with higher degrees has been increasing. That's true. But the standard explanation for that, I think, is missing something. The standard explanation treats the advent of technology and globalization of the economy as external forces, as if they were facts of nature rather than the product of policies and choices, often shaped by interests, that we, and by we I mean advanced economies, Western democracies, have deliberately embraced over the past 4 decades. We have made a choice. We, I mean the governing parties and politicians, have made a choice from the 80s up until, 2016, if we look at that period, to embrace a version of neoliberal globalization that increases the role of markets in defining and achieving the public good. That's the theory, the market faith. The idea that market mechanisms are the primary instruments for achieving the common good. And we have invested in technologies that create greater productivity, but in an economic setting where workers, though they're more productive, are able to claim less and less a share of increased productivity, and shareholders are able to claim a growing share of productivity. This is the result of social and economic and political choices, of a certain way of governing. It's not just like the weather that suddenly came upon us. So if that's the case, then we are responsible. The mainstream parties are responsible for these policies. They are responsible for a version of neoliberal globalization that has created a deepened divide between winners and losers. That hasn't just happened. That's the result of the way we have governed. And with that deepening divide came not just increased inequality of income and wealth, but also changing attitudes toward winning and losing, changing attitudes toward success and failure. Those who landed on top came to believe that their success was their own doing, the measure of their merit. And by implication, that those who struggled, those left behind, must deserve their fate as well. And so this explains why a great many working people feel that elites look down on them. And the resentment, the anger, the humiliation at being looked down upon, not only suffering wage stagnation, as many working people have, but being looked down upon. This, I think, has fueled the populist backlash against elites. It explains why more and more working people have been drawn to authoritarian populist figures who articulate their resentment against elites. We saw that with the election of Trump in 2016. We saw that in the Brexit vote in Britain, and we see that in the rise of authoritarian populist parties with much working class support in many European countries, Evelyn.
Yeah, and then the problem is also that before we dive into the political side and maybe current politics and the new election, that there is this idea that with the rhetoric of rising, there is a truly equal play field. But this play field, you explain in your book, doesn't exist, because as we see in your first, I think it's your first chapter where you talk about people wanting to get into Ivy League schools, how much parents pay for the prepping of the interviews, and how much for the SAT scores that are not properly used, or people pay money to corrupt SAT scores in order to get into those kind of universities. And also that you mentioned that from the 1% richest part of the US, most students get into these universities, more than the 60% people who have the lowest income. So there isn't an equal playing field, right? So let's say that we think meritocracy is a good ideal in the end. Is it an ideal that we can actually, in practice, also realize? Or is it something that is false?
Right. Well, Evelina, you've raised a really important question that goes right to the heart of the question I raise in the book, which is this: there are two problems with meritocracy. One of them is that we don't live up to the meritocratic principles we profess. Mm-hmm. And we see this in university admissions. Just as you've said, we see this in the fact that people from poor backgrounds find it very difficult to rise. Social mobility in the US and in Britain is actually less than it is in many European countries, even though we like to tell ourselves that America is the land of upward mobility and opportunity. The chance of rising from a poor family to a rich one is relatively small in the US. And so this is one problem. And you mentioned the SAT, the college admissions scores. In some ways, the issue here is similar to the Citotot, which is that coming from a family that is able to provide special educational and cultural opportunities and special tutors enables students to do better on these exams. So these exams are not neutral with respect to class background or cultural background. We know that. So this is the first problem with meritocracy, that we don't live up to it. Mm-hmm. But then, as you've suggested, there's a further question. Suppose we did live up to it. Suppose we could create truly equal opportunity for everyone. Suppose we could provide special help and tutoring and educational access, even for children who come from poor families. Suppose we could achieve that. That would be a good thing. It would be a good thing. But would a perfect meritocracy make for a good society? And the argument I make in the book is no. Even if we could achieve a perfect meritocracy, there would still be a dark side. And the dark side, it goes back to something we were discussing a moment ago. It would generate attitudes toward winning and losing that would be corrosive of solidarity and the common good. We can think about it this way. If where people landed really did reflect their talents and their efforts rather than their advantaged background, then the successful would be even more likely to assume that their success was their own doing, their achievement. And those who struggled would have the demoralizing thought, I had every opportunity, And look where I am. There must be something wrong with me. So even a perfect meritocracy would be flawed because it would generate hubris among the winners and humiliation among the losers. And today, even though we don't have a perfect meritocracy, the meritocratic idea in the rhetoric of rising and the promise, the political slogan, you can make it if you try, these have become so much a part of our public culture that they have already begun to generate the attitudes of elites looking down, of the successful inhaling quite deeply of their own success and forgetting the luck and good fortune that helped them on their way. So we see these attitudes now, even though we haven't lived up to a perfect meritocracy. And these attitudes explain why even a perfectly realized meritocratic society would make it very hard for the successful to identify with the circumstances and the struggles of those less fortunate, less credentialed than themselves.
Yeah, and it is very individualized, right? Because you have done it all by yourself.
Right.
If the playing field was equal, meritocracy was played out perfectly, then our individualist society would flourish even more, which is probably problematic for the common good. I want to go to like the dark side, the way we currently think about winners and losers. And in the last election, Hillary Clinton, as you wrote, really spoke about deplorables to talk about a certain part of her U.S. community, U.S. Citizens who voted for Trump.
Right.
Is that use of referring to these people as deplorables, the working class as deplorables, reason why Trump became so popular?
Well, that statement of hers by itself did not elect Trump,
but
it
that
symbolized,
idea.
it symbolized exactly the attitude that led to Trump's election. And that was the attitude among the well-educated, well-credentialed, technocratic elite toward working people. It captured this idea that half of his supporters are a basket of deplorables, as she put it. It symbolized the attitude of the elites looking down on working people. And this attitude, I think, explains Trump's ability to tap the grievances of working people who felt they were being looked down upon.
Yeah, and you blame quite a lot of like the decrease of democratic norms and the rise of autocratic politicians like Donald Trump to these left liberal politicians because they forgot the working class and they forgot the people who they were making policies for in the first place. Do you think that has changed now in the elections, for example, with Biden and Kamala? Is there a shift in rhetoric, or is it still? Are they still going on the same? Do they still use the same rhetoric, so to say?
There are signs of the beginnings of a shift in rhetoric. For example, in fact, it's very interesting that Joe Biden, though he is very much, he's been around for a long time, he is a mainstream, middle of the road Democrat. He's not a Bernie Sanders like progressive. He's not a social democrat. He's a mainstream Democrat, a liberal. But he differs from previous Democratic nominees of recent decades in one interesting respect. He's the first Democratic nominee for president in 36 years without an Ivy League degree. he went to a state school. He was not a particularly strong student. He doesn't have fancy academic credentials, unlike every Democratic nominee for 36 years. That's going back to 1984. And this actually could be a source of strength politically, not only because it enables him to identify a bit more easily with working people, and he emphasizes frequently his working class roots in a place called Scranton, Pennsylvania, a kind of blue-collar town. But he hasn't quite bought into the rhetoric of rising and the credentialism that had become a part of the Democratic Party over the last 4 decades. And so he is speaking, he does talk some about the dignity of work, which I think is the direction in which progressive parties should go. Mm-hmm. My argument in the book is that center-left parties, in order to reclaim the support of working people, in order to combat the credentialism, the looking down, should focus less on arming people for meritocratic competition and focus more on the dignity of work, on asking how we can reconfigure the economy to renew the dignity of work. That's the basic argument I make in the book about how the rhetoric and also the program should shift. Now, I can't say that Joe Biden has fully made that shift, but he seems open to it. And his background makes him, I think, more intuitively open to this kind of emphasis than the Democratic nominees in recent decades, who had very much had a more technocratic, an orientation to technocratic expertise and technocratic merit as the primary test of who can govern well. So it remains to be seen. I think he will defeat Trump in the election, not only because of this shift, and not only because he is trying to identify and speak more directly to working people, but also because of the disastrous record of Trump himself. So that's been a great help to Joe Biden. So there is, I think, a tentative movement in the right direction, but it remains to be seen if he's elected, whether he will develop this political program and message in a fuller way.
So, but you are hopeful. You think that maybe democracy can win the next election? Well,
I think Biden winning this election is a small, very small first step toward the possibility of reinvigorating democracy and democratic norms. I say it's only a small first step because by itself, tossing Trump out is really only solving the symptom of the problem. And Trump is a menace, and so it's a good thing to toss him out. But that by itself will not heal the rancor, the partisanship, the polarization, and the resentment that led to Trump's election 4 years ago. That work will remain to be done, and that will take a fundamental rethinking, not only of the Democratic Party's approach. I think it will take a fundamental rethinking of the mission of liberal, progressive, and social democratic center-left parties. I think we're seeing, and this goes beyond the American election, it's interesting that the backlash against elites was directed against mainstream parties, center right and center left. But the main casualties were parties of the center left. The Democratic Party in the United States, the Labour Party in Britain, the Social Democrats in Germany, the Socialists in France. In most places, the populist backlash devastated. Italy is another example, the Democratic Party in Italy, devastated center-left parties. And I think these parties need to rethink their fundamental mission and purpose. Because by the 2000s, these parties, which traditionally spoke for working people against the excesses of capitalism and corporate power, had become parties more attuned to the professional classes, to the well-educated classes, to the credentialed, to the technocratic elites, than to the working class voters who once constituted their base. And so there's almost been a flip in electoral support. If you look by education, now it's well-educated voters who tend to support center-left parties. And it's voters without a university education who tend to go either for conservative or for right-wing populist parties. This represents quite a dramatic reversal. And part of what I'm trying to show in the book is that this reversal came about because center-left parties embraced a meritocratic, technocratic approach to governing that missed the exclusion and even the resentments that had been building among working class people. So I think it will take a fundamental rethinking of the mission and purpose of center-left parties truly to confront the neglect that authoritarian populist parties have been able to exploit.
Yeah, it's interesting because the focus is much more due to the technocracy and meritocracy on, indeed, again, the intellect and less on what are the emotions of people? How do they feel? Do they feel dignified?
Yeah.
Do they feel valued? Do they feel... now I want to go to the way forward. How can we re-establish the common good? And I have a quote from an opinion piece that you wrote for the New York Times in April this year. If I may quote a piece of that, yeah? So you wrote, the real question is not when, but what. What kind of economy will emerge from the crisis? Will it be one that continues to create inequalities that poison our politics and undermine any sense of national community? Or will it be one that honors the dignity of work, rewards contribution to the real economy, gives workers a meaningful voice, and shares the risk of ill health and hard times? We need to ask whether to reopening the economy means going back to a system that over the past 4 decades pulled us apart, or whether we can emerge from this crisis with an economy that enables us to say and to believe that we are all in this together. So we kind of need, in our democracy, a new way of discussing these very basic, important questions with each other, all of us. So this is quite a democratic project. And I was just wondering, how does this deliberative process work? How can we start to engage with each other and raise these important questions?
Well, one starting point, paradoxically, might be this crisis, by which I mean the pandemic. Because those of us who were able to work from home during this pandemic can't help but recognize how deeply we depend on workers we often overlook. I'm thinking not only of the healthcare providers in the hospitals who are doing such important work caring for COVID patients. I'm thinking also of delivery workers, warehouse workers, grocery store clerks, home health care workers, childcare workers, truckers. These are not the best paid or the most honored workers. And yet now we are recognizing them as essential workers, as key workers. We call them that. We put out signs thanking them. We applaud them. Mm-hmm. So this could be a possible opening for a broader public debate about how to bring their pay and recognition into better alignment with the importance of the work they do. Mm-hmm. And if we're able to initiate that broader debate about the dignity of work and about what really counts as an important contribution to the economy and to the common good, that debate could raise these fundamental questions in a new way. We often assume that the money people make is the measure of their contribution to the common good. And this assumption has deepened its hold in recent decades when we've been in the grip of a market faith. But having a public debate about what really counts as a valuable contribution to the common good is a way of reclaiming from markets that judgment. Another way of looking at it is this. When we simply rely on markets and on the labor market to tell us, to reveal what is the relative importance of the contributions different workers make, what we're doing is we are outsourcing our moral judgment about what really matters to markets. But this is a mistake. And so the broader public debate I call for in the book is a debate about what really counts as a valuable contribution to the common good. The dignity of work is a broad heading for that kind of debate. But in order to have that debate, we can't figure out what counts as a valuable contribution unless we also, at the same time, debate what the common good really means. And so this is the kind of broader public debate that I am urging and arguing for in the book as an alternative to the neoliberal version of globalization that we've had and the meritocratic, technocratic orientation that has enabled us to ratify or to justify the results of who wins and who loses. So this is the kind of alternative that I'm hoping that we can begin at least to explore in public discourse.
Yeah, I think ideally it would be wonderful, but then there are so many changes that need to be made on a very large systemic level, obviously. And now currently you mentioned that we applaud health workers now, and we applaud people who still educate our children, who pick up the garbage, who bring us our packages at home. But it seems to be that on the long term, at least in the Netherlands, there is not a lot of debate about how they will be honored or rewarded, how we should change that. Like here, the KLM, our airplane company, they are rewarded quite well for their suffering, so to say, whereas health workers aren't. So, okay, so we need to find a common ground for what is the common good. That seems to be, but how do we find that? Do we need beforehand certain ethical norms or ideas or ideals that help us guide through what is commonly good, or does it need to be constituted through all these debates, through interaction?
I think we have to work from both directions at once. We need to reorient our ethical ideals, but we can only do that in democratic public discourse through proposing and debating very concrete measures that can test what we really value. For example, currently, in the meritocratic system we have now, that depends on the credentializing through universities, we make higher education, and by we, I mean our society has made higher education the arbiter of opportunity in a meritocratic society. We've assigned universities the job of dispensing the credentials and defining the merit that is rewarded in the economy. In some ways, this has enhanced the power and prestige of higher education. But it's not good for the society as a whole, and I'm not sure it's even good for the educational project itself. Just a word about this last. My worry is, and I see this, I see it in my students, that turning universities into sorting machines for a technocratic society leads to the sorting function, the credentializing function, to crowd out the educational mission. Because by the time they arrive, students who have survived this intensely competitive, high-pressure adolescence to get into these selective universities, they're winners, but they're wounded winners. They become so accustomed to gathering credentials and to achieving and to winning the approval of their parents and teachers and the admissions committees and doing well on tests, that there's little space left very often to explore, to reflect, to step back, to think what's worth caring about and why. Because there's yet more networking to be done, more credentials to be gathered, more grades to be competed for. So I worry that that converting universities into sorting machines is damaging the educational mission. That's one problem. The other problem is not the wounded winners, but those who are excluded. And it's important to recognize something that we can often forget. Most people don't have a university degree. Nearly 2/3 of Americans don't, and the figure is similar in Britain and most European societies. So it's a mistake to create an economy that sets as a necessary condition for dignified work and a decent life that you have a university degree. And so I think we should invest more in forms of learning on which most people depend. In the US setting, that means state colleges, two-year community colleges, vocational and technical training and apprenticeships, not only to invest more in financial terms, but also to accord greater honor and recognition and esteem to people who pursue these tracks. They do a better job of this in Germany than we do in the United States in terms of honoring and rewarding people who pursue trades and vocational and technical training. So that's one shift, but it illustrates the question you asked, which is, this would be a concrete shift in policy, but it would also at the same time be a way of rethinking and debating the norms, the values, the ethical outlook on what really counts as success, what really counts as contributing, what really is worthy of dignity and social recognition and esteem. I also have some suggestions in the book about how we could reconfigure the tax system to tax labor less and financial speculation, for example, more. Also as a way, not just to redistribute income from the rich to the poor, to the struggling, but also as a way of prompting this public debate about what social roles and economic roles really do contribute most to the common good.
Yeah, very, I think very important, very interesting. What I do have one hesitation, and that is, okay, we need to find a common ground, but how do you do it in a society that is so partisan, so divided, where people don't seem to speak the same language anymore? as well as there are also people who have certain kind of ideas that are bluntly racist or very unequal, or maybe too individualized. So how can we find a way to go beyond that? Does every voice need to be heard in this debate? Maybe that's another way of phrasing that.
Well, ideally, in a democracy, every voice should be heard, but there is also, as a precondition for effective democratic debate, a system of moral and civic education that has to be part of any democratic society. We often assume that democracy is about giving everyone a chance to vote on the election day, but democracy is really about cultivating the virtues that enable us to have debates where everyone's voice is heard, but where there is a system of moral and civic education that challenges from the start the tendencies of some toward racist or otherwise destructive, hateful voice, and to show how incompatible it is with a decent society and with a politics of the common good. So what this points up is whatever we might do by shifting the terms of public discourse and trying to bring about a broader political project that takes greater account of the dignity of work. There's a lot of work still to be done in the background with our educational system, building up civic education. And by this, I don't mean trying to impose on young people politically correct opinions. I mean teaching young people how to reason together, argue together, debate with one another on the basis of civility and mutual respect. This is a civic virtue that we desperately need. And I think that the political system by itself can't teach it. We have to look to the civil society, including schools, including colleges and universities, also including the media, which needs to provide forums for civil, respectful public disagreement on big questions that matter, rather than simply to give us the kind of shouting matches that encourage partisan, ideological, entrenched positions where people shout past one another without really listening. So a lot of this work has to take place within civil society, as well as within the sphere of politics and public discourse.
Yeah, clear. Let's hope that the election of Biden is the first small step into this direction. That would be wonderful. I think it is time for 2 questions from the audience. I don't know if you are going to read them out loud? Yeah, Jan is going to read them out loud. Thank you very much for this interview, Michael. Great.
Thank you so much, Evelina. I've really enjoyed it.
Me too.
So we'll continue, but we'll continue, and you can jump back in perhaps if you like. Let's hear from Jan what the
let's hear from the audience.
Yes. Well, we have a very engaged audience. We've had over 30 questions posed, and they were upvoted. So I'm going to pose some of we would say most interesting ones to you. The first one, and I want to mention the name of the person who asked the question, Angernis Terwij, I hope I'm pronouncing this right, asks which contemporary or historic society best avoids inequalities on the basis of academic credentials, to your view?
I think that there is no golden age where everything was equal in terms of mutual regard, winning and losing, succeeding and failing. In fact, so I don't have a golden age. This may be disappointing, or a model. I mean, some political philosophers look back to the model of ancient Athens for genuine democratic participation. But then, of course, ancient Athens is a flawed model because in the agora, in the ecclesia, the people debating did not include women, and there were slaves at home looking after the household chores. So there was exclusion there, and yet there are elements, there are strands of ideals that we can find in different historical experiences. To jump to the contemporary world, we can look to the period from the end of the Second World War up until the mid-1970s, not as a model in all respects, but when the intense division based on winners and losers and credentialism was less acute, less intense than it has since become. And during that 3 to 4 decade period, from the 40s to the late 70s, let's say, there were great achievements. In the US, we had the civil rights movement, the dismantling of segregation. But in the economy generally, we had economic growth that was broadly shared among classes during that 30 to 40 year period. Whereas the 4 decades since 1980, there's been income growth from globalization, but almost all of it has gone to those in the top 20%. And those, the bottom 50%, have realized almost none of that economic growth. So there are different elements of different historical periods, whether the civil rights movement or the period of broadly shared economic growth after the Second World War, or going all the way back to ancient Athens, the element of public participation, though with exclusions. So I think we have to pick strands of ideals, of achievements from different historical periods to point us to what's worth aspiring to today.
All right, thank you. On behalf of Mr. Wei, I think that that's a great answer to her question. I'm going over to another question that might be a little bit closer to your daily, let's say, daily routine. Given your views on talent, this question comes from Lara Mikoki. Given your views on talent, how do you or would you resolve this via measuring, grading your own students?
I hate grading. I'll give you a secret. Grading is, for me, the worst part of teaching, because I think grading is more about the credentializing function than it is about teaching and learning. Now, designing the exams or the assignments, that's about teaching and learning. And encouraging people to do well on them and advising them on how to improve, that's part of teaching and learning. Grading isn't. So in the best of all worlds, my educational utopia, there wouldn't be grading. So I struggle with that. And, but I dislike it. I do have in the book a proposal that some may find controversial, which is not about grading. Evelina knows what I'm referring to. It's about admission. And the proposal is for highly selective colleges and universities where there are vastly more applicants who are well qualified than there are places. I argue for separating out those who are well qualified, and among that group, admitting based on lottery. So there I do recommend a departure from the standard mode of university admissions. And if I could do without grading, that would make me happier about the mission of teaching and learning. It would be a way of reclaiming the educational mission from the sorting, credentializing mission that has come to loom too large.
All right, thank you. I am going to go ahead and ask one more question because it's also a very great question. I'm going to paraphrase and shorten it a little bit, but I think we can get the gist of it. It's from Gijs Hassebroek, and he asks, do you think that the decrease of religion in the Western world has contributed to the attitude we have towards humility?
It's a fascinating question. I would say that the belief that our success is our own doing, that we are as individuals responsible for our lot in life, for our fate. The idea that we are self-making and self-sufficient as individual human agents. I think this is what's led us astray. Now, one antidote to that way of thinking, one alternative, can come from various faith traditions. Though I think it's that on other sources, there are other sources of challenge to the idea of the self-made, self-making, self-sufficient individual that come from non-religious resources. But what these two alternative moral or ethical traditions, be they religious or be they secular, have in common is that they challenge the idea that we are self-made and self-sufficient. And they do so by reminding us of the role of luck or fortune, or in the case of faith traditions, of blessings and gifts that enable us to flourish. Even being alive to the role of luck in life can prompt a certain humility. The humility that looks upon those less fortunate than us and enables us to say, there, but for the accident of fate, or the grace of God, or the luck of the draw, go I. So this humility and this ability to identify, to put ourselves in other people's shoes, this source of humility can come from religious traditions. It can also come from a general appreciation of the role of luck and fortune in life, and from our indebtedness to family, teachers, community, country, the times in which we live. But what we need are moral sources, secular or religious, that recall us to this humility, that remind us that our success is in large part our good fortune. And this orientation to succeeding, to winning in a competitive society, this sense of humility is the civic virtue we need now. It's the beginning of the way back from the harsh ethic of success that drives us apart. It gestures, it may point us, this sense of humility, toward a less rancorous, more generous public life, toward a politics of the common good.
All right. I believe we couldn't have asked for a better last question and a better last answer. On behalf of the whole team and also Evelien, who already thanked you before, I would like to thank you very much for this inspiring event, conversation. I believe there's a very big group of very engaged people who might be running to the bookstore right now. And I would now like to thank the audience as well. Thank you for joining us at Brainwash Digital. If you've missed part of the stream, you can always look at it again or rewatch it for up to 10 days after this event. We would also like to hear your feedback. Click on the feedback link that's in the screen right now. And later today, there's more Brainwash Digital with Gia Tolentino and Marta Nussbaum coming up. And we hope to see you again. Thank you very much.